Sunderland grew out of a fishing village called Soender-land, or land that is cut asunder, which existed by 1100. And by the 18th century, Sunderland had replaced Wearmouth, its original name, because it stands on the mouth of the River Wear, and this explains why we call it Sunderland now and not Wearmouth. In the past, Sunderland has exported coal, lime, alum, ropes, glass and pottery, to name just a few things. Sunderland was the home of Pyrex and it was a major shipbuilding centre. So with so much industrial activity going on, what kind of folklore does this city have? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are finishing off our Folklore of Northern Cities month this week with Sunderland. And like I say, a few people were a bit surprised that I was doing Sunderland because I'm from Newcastle, and for anyone pretty much outside of the British Isles, you're probably not aware of the rivalry between the two cities. But I will get to that because it is kind of sort of a little bit important to what we're going to look at, but also completely irrelevant at the same time. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of history of Sunderland first, just so you've got a bit of an idea if it's not somewhere that you're familiar with. And it actually began life as 3 separate settlements on the River Wear, which is sort of the next major river down from Newcastle, which is on the Tyne. And while there is evidence of activity in the area long before these settlements were actually founded, the settlements themselves date to 674. King Ecgfrith of Northumbria granted land to Benedict Biscop, who founded Monk Wearmouth Monastery in the area. Later, the Bishop of Durham gained these lands, and then they became Bishop Wearmouth. And then that's where we end up with a fishing village called Sunderland, and then obviously by the 18th century that had become Sunderland. Now, where Newcastle's inhabitants are called Geordies, nobody actually knows why. Sunderland's people are called Mackhams, and there are 2 theories as to where the name came from. It might have referred to the Blue Macks, or the Scottish soldiers that were stationed in Sunderland during the English Civil War, or it might have come from shipbuilders whose phrase Mackham and Tackham referred to ships being made in and then taken from Sunderland. And like I said, Sunderland and Newcastle are famously rivals, but the reason's actually got nothing to do with football. It mostly comes out in football now with things like the hoo-ha that's usually created on Derby Day, when like fans have to be bussed in and things like that, and it all gets very, very silly. But the reason actually dates back to, again, the English Civil War. And Charles I backed Newcastle for the coal trade rather than Sunderland. So then during the Civil War, Sunderland retaliated by backing the parliamentarians, while Newcastle supported the royalist cause. Boy, did we back the wrong horse. At the ensuing Battle of Baldon Hill, Sunderland actually won with the help of the Scots. So during the brief Commonwealth period under Cromwell, the parliamentarians repaid Sunderland for their loyalty by backing the city over Newcastle. Now, I would argue that since then, obviously Sunderland and Newcastle actually have a whole lot more in common with each other than either city really ever has done with London. Both are industrial cities with long histories that have had to find new identities with the loss of traditional manufacturing and mining jobs. Both cities have had to basically carve out a space for themselves. And I think both cities basically get forgotten about quite a lot in the face of anything that goes on within the M25. So I personally think that we should really get on a bit better than we do. But there we go. I am also biased because my dad's from Sunderland, but never mind. Now we're going to get into the folklore. And I'm going to start off with the Cold Lad of Hilton. And I have covered him before in the Brownie episode. But obviously you might only be coming to this to just listen to Sunderland folklore, and you might not have heard that before. And he's pretty much a legendary character in that particular part of the world. So I thought it was only right to include him again. So this is a slightly briefer version of the legend. If you've heard the Brownies episode, and if you haven't, it's probably the version that you might already know. So the Cold Lad of Hilton, in one version of the legend, because there are 2, was a brownie who lived in Hilton Castle near Sunderland, and you can actually reach that on the metro line now. The servants rarely saw him, but they heard him at night, and as is typical with brownies, if they tidied the kitchen, he would create a mess and basically throw everything around, and if they left it messy, he would tidy it for them. Now, the servants actually got a bit tired of these antics, and they knew that the only way to rid themselves of a brownie was to present him with new clothes. So they laid out a green hooded cloak beside the kitchen fire and they hid so that they could then see what was going to happen, green obviously being the colour associated with the fairies. So at midnight the coal lad came in the kitchen, he spotted the cloak, put it on and essentially danced around the kitchen until dawn, so that must have been for quite some time. And then at sunrise he cried out, "Here's a cloak and there's a hood, the coal lad of Hilton will do no more good." And then he vanished never to be seen again. So that was, in their view, the right thing to do. There is, however, the second version of the story, and in this one, basically we have to go back centuries ago when a baron had a servant boy. I mean, he probably would have had several, but there was a particular servant boy in this story. And the baron had ordered his horse to be ready, but the servant didn't arrive with the horse at the specified time. So the baron went to the stables and found the servant boy asleep, and obviously therefore no longer able to do his duty because he wasn't awake. So incensed by the servant's behaviour, the baron struck him with a pitchfork, killing him instantly. Suddenly aware of what he'd done, he covered the body with straw and then threw the body into a pond that night. And according to the legend, someone actually discovered a boy's skeleton in the pond years later, although no details were actually given as to why they were looking. But either way, it seems that the coal lad of Hilton in that particular version of the story is actually the ghost of the servant boy, not a brownie. Surprisingly though, and this is the additional bit that wasn't in the brownies episode because I've just discovered this, but it seems that activity actually continued. So in the 19th century, people actually reported hearing dishes being smashed at the castle, and a witness who'd lived nearby in the 1960s as a child actually claimed to have seen the coal lad in 1969. And a mysterious force apparently puts out fires and turns off car lights near the castle, which just seems like an oddly specific thing to do. Those things all make me think that they're actually dealing with a ghost, not a brownie, because the brownie would literally just leave once presented with clothes, so there's no reason for the brownie to come back. Whereas obviously if we're looking at a ghost or a poltergeist, then chucking things around and whatnot would obviously be more of a thing. And we're going to go on to haunted theatres, because it's quite easy when you look at city folklore, legends and so on, to come across a haunted theatre or two, or several if you're Helsinki. But in this particular instance, Sunderland has two. And the first is the Empire Theatre, which has various ghosts, and it first opened in 1907. It's generally sort of the home of the Christmas pantomimes now, and you tend to get quite a lot of West End shows coming up and getting put on at the Empire now. But a white lady apparently haunts the theatre, and she's believed to be the ghost of Molly Moselle, a dancer who went missing in 1949. Now, she'd actually been working as an assistant stage manager at the theatre, and she disappeared after going out to buy a birthday card. Literally nobody ever saw her again after that. And while Molly was never found, human remains did turn up in the River Wear in October 1960. Some suggested it was Molly, but it's never been proven conclusively because obviously they didn't have any of the kind of forensic things that they've got now. So for some reason, Molly's believed to haunt the men's toilets in the dress circle, if indeed it is actually Molly. And a little boy actually claimed to have talked to her in the toilet during a performance in 2016. Now, the fact he came from London, had never actually visited Sunderland before and probably hadn't heard the story, meant people paid attention when he suddenly announced that he'd been talking to a woman called Molly in the toilet. The next ghost, and I really like this one, is a grey lady, and we know how much I like grey ladies, and she haunts the gallery, but staff don't seem particularly perturbed by her, and one member of staff actually said that she likes to watch the shows from there, and she's basically making sure that the performance is running smoothly and everyone's enjoying it. And audience members have reported seeing a grey figure behind them in the gallery, although staff, to be fair, won't rule out that that might just be an usher that they've seen. But I really, really like that idea of a grey lady sitting performing quality control from a gallery. And we've had the idea of ghosts, and indeed the man in grey at the Drury Lane Theatre Royal, sitting watching a performance, and it's been a good look woman. But in this case, I just quite like the fact that the grey lady's just overseeing what's going on. So I don't know who she is, but I particularly like that one. And then finally, some claim that comedian Sid James actually haunts the theatre after he had a heart attack there in 1976. And it's a really horrible story, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but he basically had the heart attack on stage, and he sadly died in the ambulance on the way to hospital. But there's different stories about different people who then refused to work at the Empire Theatre. So one source said Barbara Windsor wouldn't work there after it happened. Somebody else said Les Dawson wouldn't work there because he'd apparently seen Sid James's ghost. Although somebody else then disagreed and said, well, he never mentioned anything at the time. He's only mentioned it in retrospect. So it all just gets a little bit muddled up at that point. Some people have reported hearing James's quite distinctive laugh in his old dressing room, and some performers actually hate being assigned that dressing room. So whether he is still hanging around there or not, I don't know. I think if I was going to encounter any of those three, I'd probably prefer the Grey Lady, if I'm honest, because she seems like she's quite sort of on the task, as it were. But the other haunted theatre is the Royalty Theatre off Chester Road, and a church originally stood on the site. And it's a bit confusing because some sources say that a church originally stood on the site and then the building was used as a hospital in the Second World War. Other sources say that it started out as a church, that then became a theatre and then a hospital and then back to a theatre again. But either way, people report hearing shouting, disembodied footsteps and slamming doors in the theatre. And other visitors also report seeing a man sitting at the back of the auditorium. None of the activity necessarily seems to actually hurt anyone though, so it just kind of sounds unsettling or bizarre rather than actually scary. So just bear that in mind if you're going to any kind of performance at either of those theatres. We are also going to move on to pub folklore because obviously, you know, cities are full of pubs, so they're a really good venue for folklore and legends and so on. And the first pub, because I've got two, the first one manages to combine two of my favourite things. So I've already had Grey Lady ghosts and secret tunnels. And there's also a green lady and a pink lady on site as well. So the Jolly Sailor Inn in Whitburn really does have quite a lot going for it. Now, it is described as being an ancient coaching inn, which has been in operation for over 3 centuries. I'm not really sure how old something has to be before you can give it the name ancient, but there we go. 3 centuries is still pretty good going though. And they are still in operation as well, same name and everything. Now, not much is known about the Grey Lady, although the catering manager described seeing a grey figure going into a bedroom, said that the figure looked like a pall of smoke, and also thought it seemed to be an old lady as well. So whether the Grey Lady is a previous guest or a previous member of staff, obviously no way of knowing. Also could be associated with the building that was there beforehand, whatever that might have been. I mean, with 300 years of history, you've got a fair few people to choose from. The Green Lady, on the other hand, and obviously I've got a whole episode on Green Ladies as well, because they've got some crossover potential with fairies, but this particular Green Lady wanders the corridors, and she's believed to be a local girl who took a fancy to a visiting coachman. Now, she bought a green dress to impress him, but sadly it didn't work. It's unclear what happened, whether she thought something was going on and he just wasn't bothered, or whether he led her on. None of the stories really say, but either way, he rejected her. So she actually died after pining for him, and now haunts the upstairs area. Like I said, there are also rumours of a pink lady, but no one actually seems to know that much about her. Other investigations have turned up a nurse and a soldier, but again, little is known about them. But the secret tunnel though, and obviously we mentioned the one in Carlisle last time, but this particular one apparently connects the inn with the Marsden Grotto, which is the pub that's about 2 miles to the north, kind of on the way up to South Shields. Now, normally I would dismiss this story given the plethora of secret passage legends around the British Isles and the fact that most of them are probably nonsense. But this one, I'm a little bit more inclined to go there might be something in it, purely because of the fact that the Marsden Grotto was actually carved out of the cliff to start with. So I think it was possibly even blasted out, but obviously I mentioned that in the smuggling episode a little while ago. So the idea of the Marsden Grotto being the start or end of a secret passage to me actually seems a lot less far-fetched because it's already been dug out of the cliff anyway. The bit that is far-fetched is the idea of a tunnel reaching for over 2 miles to another pub in Whitburn. That's the bit that I'm a bit like, that would take a really long time to do. Although it might be sandstone, which obviously is a bit softer. But anyway, I just thought that was quite cool that you've got Grey Ladies and secret tunnels all in the same pub. But the other pub that we're going to look at is actually in Sunderland itself on Silksworth Road, and this is the Ship Isis pub. And I have actually been to that one. And it does have a weird atmosphere, and I can't help thinking part of the reason is obviously the wood that they've got on the walls is so dark. It makes it look really narrow and just a bit, I don't want to say depressing because that's the wrong word, but you know when you're in like a really dark room and it can obviously have a bit of an impact on your mood. So I found it a bit of a strange, but it didn't help that like the football had just come out when we were in there, so it got really busy really quickly. But I can debunk the particular legend associated with the Ship Isis almost immediately, but because it is a local legend and it pops up in pretty much every article that I found about it, I thought, well, we're going to have a look at it anyway. But people have reported seeing two ghostly children around the pub, which in and of itself would be weird to start with. But as the legend runs, their mother, Mary Cotton, murdered them in tunnels beneath the pub, so we're back to tunnels again. Other customers have actually reported a Victorian lady in the pub, so there is speculation that this is Mary herself. So, first things first, Mary Cotton, if you're not familiar with her, is one of the most notorious female killers, at least in North East history. Some articles have actually said that she was Britain's most prolific serial killer until Harold Shipman, so there's a claim to fame for the region. And while no one knows exactly how many people she poisoned, it is believed to be at least 21. And I did cover it in the tea episode, but again, if you haven't heard that one, we're going to have a little look at the background of Mary Cotton before I explain why the legend's probably not right. But she's particularly notorious because she kept taking out insurance policies on her partners and children before they died of what looked like gastric fever. Now, the symptoms of that are incredibly similar to those of arsenic poisoning, and it was also an incredibly common thing for people to end up with in those days. And Cotton was essentially using tea as her delivery mechanism, allowing her to keep giving the poison until it built up in the body to a lethal dose. And Cotton apparently kept a small teapot specifically for her poisoning, and Beamish Museum in County Durham holds a teapot that's believed to be hers, which is a black wedgwood teapot, and it was donated in 1972. But Cotton was finally caught because she tried to give up one of her many stepchildren to a workhouse, and when they wouldn't take him unaccompanied by her, she'd passed a comment to a local official that she wouldn't be troubled by him for long. When the 7-year-old then died very shortly after, the official thought that's very odd and informed the police, and they held an autopsy which found arsenic in his stomach. On the back of that, everyone kind of went, hang on, the other cases of gastric fever might not have been gastric fever, and that then led to exhumations of other people close to her, and arsenic was found in their stomachs as well. She was hanged in 1873 for her crimes. I have actually seen people trying to go, oh yeah, well, it would have been really difficult for a woman to survive in those days. And I'm like, yeah, but it's really difficult to kind of write off that many people dying of arsenic poisoning after she'd taken out insurance policies on them. And I find that a really strange argument. But anyway, back to the folklore. She had actually worked in Sunderland. Apparently at one point, quite scarily, she was a nurse. So she does have links with the city, that bit's not in dispute, but she was hanged in 1873 and the ship Isis opened in 1885, so she couldn't have visited the pub itself in her lifetime, so it's unlikely that she's haunted because it was a favourite spot to go, although it does say that it stands near the location of one of her homes, and I can't help finding it a bit unlikely that she would haunt the pub rather than the site of her house. As to murdering her children in the tunnels, Cotton administered arsenic at home and passed off their deaths as gastric fever. That's the bit to remember. And Jason Button, in one of the newspaper articles, repeated a legend that she burned the bodies of 2 children, which is kind of unlikely because she would need their bodies in order to claim the life insurance. But that, to be honest, raises the really chilling possibility of another female murderer in the area. And given people report disembodied screams and singing on the site, I'm leaning towards the latter explanation. And I think it's one of those things, because she's so notorious, it makes for a good story to sort of try and drum up interest in your pub. But, I mean, they do food, and I suppose it's a nice enough place, apart from, as I say, I had a bit of a weird reaction when I walked in. But then again, I had also heard it was supposed to be haunted before I walked in, so it could entirely just be all in my imagination. But at the same time, I'm like, you don't need to try and lay claim to, like, one of the most notorious serial killers in 19th century history, you know, when the basics of the story don't really line up, but never mind. The next story, however, I was really pleased to discover this one, and that sounds mad, I know it does, but we've had poltergeists aplenty on the podcast, and a few people have asked what they've got to do with folklore, and I genuinely think that folklore is such an amorphous, flexible field that a lot of things to do with the supernatural do belong in folklore, and I think a lot of the time the stories that we spread about incidents, if they are actually to do with ghosts and hauntings, become folklore because people continue to talk about them. And poltergeists obviously are something that people continue to talk about. And then people add bits that they've heard and the story continues. And some cases then has a bit of a dovetail with urban legends. So poltergeists are worth looking at. Now, this one comes from the Bishop Wearmouth area of Sunderland. And it does sound very similar to the likes of Enfield and Battersea, but there's one huge difference. Because I think if you say poltergeist to most people, they'll say like Enfield, Battersea, maybe Pontefract. They generally don't say any of the other ones. But they're all from the 20th century, and this one happened in 1839. And this was a girl called Mary Jobson who lived in Bishop Wearmouth, which at the time was a village but is now part of Sunderland. And at 13, she fell ill. Now, that was relatively commonplace in the 19th century, but what happened next wasn't. So other residents actually heard inexplicable bangs and footsteps around the house. Bells would ring even though there was no one there to ring them, and doctors would actually find Mary's medicine snatched out of their hands. But even more bizarrely, 6 months after it all started, an astronomical painting would appear on Mary's ceiling. And if anyone painted whitewash over it, it would then reappear, which is very Canterville ghost as far as I'm concerned, which incidentally, if you think that's where someone got the idea from, didn't actually appear until 1887. Now, writer Arthur Morrison actually didn't consider it as a poltergeist case per se, but he actually lumped it into his possession category. Please banish all thoughts of demons from your mind, because Morrison defines it as, and I quote, cases in which a departed spirit enters or seems to enter the body of a person still living, using it in its own way, speaking with its mouth, hearing with its ears, and so forth, end quote. So Morrison sees possession as being essentially where the ghost of the dead kind of uses you like a ventriloquist dummy. Now, he does also state that a lot of cases are probably more likely a mental health issue, but there are some cases that defy explanation, and for him, Jobson fell into that latter category. What's really helpful is someone actually wrote a book about the whole affair, and it's actually got the notes from the doctors involved in it, so that was quite a good source to find. And one of the doctors, R.B. Embleton, described her early symptoms thus, and I quote, on my first visit, she complained of severe pain on the back part of the head, increased on pressure. Her eyes were very sensible to the light and slightly injected with blood. She had a sensation of sickness but no vomiting. The heat of the skin was a little above the natural temperature. Her bowels were constipated and her pulse about 120, but very weak and frequently irregular, end quote. They use leeches on her. Why? It's madness. But anyway, some of those symptoms to me actually sound a bit like a migraine, particularly the first one. So you're kind of like, it should just suffering really badly with migraines then. Now, she was absolutely put through the ringer, both with her symptoms and the subsequent treatment for her symptoms, because she started hearing voices, water would appear from nowhere in the room, and she would also make predictions that were occasionally accurate as well. Now, I will say there's a happy ending, because after 8 months, it just literally ended as quickly as it had started, and she appeared to be cured, and she went on to live a really mundane life. So that's good. That's a nice ending. But there's not really a huge amount about the case beyond that as to whether it was all activity on Jobson's part or whether there was actually something in the house. So I can't really say one way or the other. But I did think it was worth including because it's such an early example of that kind of phenomena. So I might look into that a little bit more for a future episode, but for now I just thought it was quite interesting to include it. Now, there are other tales of hauntings, and the last one I'm going to deal with that we're going to come back to had me absolutely in hysterics when I read it. But before I get to that bit, again, I looked on the paranormal database for this, and they've actually got a range of other interesting ghost stories. So in early 1957, people living at a house on General Havelock Road reported being prodded or feeling icy cold water poured over them, except there was no actual water, just the sensation of it. Footsteps could be heard ringing out on the staircase when there was no one there. Doors would open and close on their own, and a weird zigzag line appeared and disappeared on the living room wall. Part of me did kind of go, oh my god, did the house just have really bad subsidence or something? But again, without more information, it's difficult to tell. According to the story, the Bishop of Jarrow blessed the house, and while the haunting seemed to end, it eventually restarted, so unsurprisingly, the family moved. There's no discussion of whether or not it's happened again, or later people have been bothered, but I always find that quite interesting. I've dealt with hospital folklore before, and Ward F62 at the Royal Infirmary Hospital, which was dedicated to palliative care, and I think anyone who works in palliative care is an absolute hero. But this particular ward was apparently haunted by one of its doctors, and he was famous for the scent of his very pungent cigars. And staff actually continued to smell them in the ward anytime there was a medical crisis, so people sort of started to put two and two together and going, hang on a minute, we can smell them. and then something happens. So it actually became so common that any time they smelled the cigar, staff would actually check all of the patients just to make sure that everything was all right. So I quite like the idea that the doctor is like still hanging around to keep an eye on people. And then before the Second World War, children would actually avoid an open area called the Swallow, which lay at the end of Westheath Avenue, because stories abounded of a phantom man described as a ghoul haunting the land. The North East Aircraft Museum also claims to be haunted, but I haven't put anything else in about that, which is probably bad of us, but I did do an overnight investigation there in the early 2010s and I'm entirely unconvinced about it, but never mind. That might have just been my experience. And this is the one I absolutely could not resist including this legend. It's really recent because it's from 2004. But when else am I going to include Greggs in an episode of Fabulous Folklore? For anyone outside the British Isles, if you've never been here, how the hell do you describe Greggs? It's basically, it started out as a bakery in the Gosforth area of Newcastle, so it is a Newcastle institution. And they sell like pasties and baked goods and like sausage rolls and things like that, but they've branched out into donuts and muffins and all that kind of thing. They also do sandwiches and the like. Now I'm just sounding like I'm doing a sales pitch for them and I'm not, but I do really like Greggs. I've got a lot of time for them. They are essentially a local business to where I am, and they obviously are a British business elsewhere. They do work for charity, they work with food banks and things like that, so Greggs is an interesting brand. But yeah, when am I going to get Greggs into Fabulous Folklore? And I've actually called this section in the blog post Pasties and Poltergeists, which I was quite proud of, because this story basically involved the branch of Greggs on Sea Road in the Fulwell district because of a poltergeist. And I did actually look it up on Google Street View and that Greggs is still there. And it's absolutely typical of the buildings that you find in the area, where it's essentially a street of single-storey shops, because there was a huge amount of building done to house workers, and they're all, I think they're called Sunderland cottages, so they're all just single-storey dwellings, and you know, they've got all the bits and pieces that you would expect in a house, but obviously it means that the shops end up with a very similar layout, except this branch of Greggs does have space for a small flat upstairs, which does become important to our story. Now, according to Paranormal Database, staff experienced a range of activity, including banging sounds coming from the staff room or electrical items turning on by themselves. And they also smell lavender around the shop, which I can assure you is not a smell that is widely associated with Greggs. And people actually started to blame the ghost of an elderly woman who had lived upstairs. Staff also heard noises upstairs as if someone was moving furniture, although the flat was empty at the time, and the noises were at their worst early in the morning. Now, paranormal investigator Mike Hallowell suspected a poltergeist at work, but staff insisted the spirit was friendly, and because the activity seemed to be restricted to items seemingly operating on their own, banging sounds and a phantom scent, I'd be hesitant to categorise that as a poltergeist, because there doesn't seem to be any goal to intimidate staff. There's no reports of anything being thrown, damaged or going missing. It's just kind of almost like someone's bimbling about and kind of trying to get involved, but not actually having anything to do with the shop, if that makes sense. Now, the activity does seem to have ended as soon as it all began, so who knows what on earth was going on there. So ultimately, what do we make of these Sunderland ghost stories? Obviously, most of these legends have been ghost stories. Obviously, Sunderland's got a lot of other things in its history as well, but these are the ones that kind of stood out as being interesting to relate on a folklore podcast rather than a local history podcast. And I think the fact that there's actually a relatively high number of recent ones, I think is really interesting, because it does then bring you sort of into the actual psychic activity of the city now, rather than just focusing on like legendary stuff back in like the 18th century or the 19th century or whatever. But I do think that a lot of it does just remind us that cities are essentially a concentration of people, and I say this literally every time we do city folklore. You've got a high concentration of people in that particular bit of land. You've also got the accumulation of human life over time as well, so you haven't just simply got a lot of people in one place at the moment. That then also continues sort of throughout time as well, so you've almost got like 3 coordinates to deal with. It would be really weird if there wasn't ghost stories attached to cities, and I think in a lot of ways they just kind of remind us that, you know, we're not the first ones here, we're not going to be the last ones here, you hope anyway, depending on the way certain things go. So Yeah, I do think, as I say, if you're on the northeast and you haven't been to Sunderland for a while, I would recommend the museum and the Winter Garden. And yeah, I hope that the National Glass Centre manages to get itself sorted out, because that was a really, really interesting attraction. And my granddad actually used to be a research chemist at Pyrex, so I was always really interested in a lot of the glassmaking stuff. So I hope that they manage to get themselves sorted out. But yeah, there's no animosity from me towards Sunderland at all. So as I say, if you are from Newcastle, go and have a look. And if you are from Sunderland and you know any other legends, and obviously please do feel free to post a comment either on the YouTube video or on the blog post that this episode is attached to. The links are in the show notes. Speaking of show notes, you'll also find a link to the talk I'm doing with Cresswell Crags online at 6 p.m. British Standard Time, or British Summer Time, I think it might be. I can't remember. It's BST, whatever the time zone thing stands for. I can't remember now. On the 5th of August, and we're looking at the folklore of magical trees. So we'll be looking at elder, rowan, hawthorn and hazel. It is free, but obviously donations do help Cresswell Crags out. And you're more than welcome to come along and see that. And obviously that's online, so you don't have to go anywhere for it. And next month I'm doing a request-based series, because someone asked me if I would actually do more folklore on birds. Because I do share some on Instagram periodically, but I don't really have like a huge amount really, which I should do. So I'm going to do an entire month on birds. So I'll have like coastal birds, mythical birds, so the phoenix and so on. So August is going to be very, very avian related. So yeah, I hope to see you then. Anyway, this episode has gone on a lot longer than I was expecting, but I found a lot of ghost stories. So I will see you next week when we start having a look at the folklore of birds. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.